Hey everybody, good evening. Happy Wednesday. Hope you all are doing well. And welcome to another Harmonic Atheist live stream. I'm just going to give everybody just a couple minutes to come on in. And I did want to mention a couple things here as we're giving people that time. I wanted to say, number one, thanks to everybody who checked in on me. A bunch of people checked in on me while I was sort of extra busy here the last few days, taking care of some family things with my kiddos and so forth. But I appreciate you all so much and hope everybody's doing well. And I also want to mention that some of the live streams that I do are more of a monologue, and this one I'm going to do as more of a sort of a monologue, but also I really appreciate your thoughts, your feedback. So there'll be quite a few parts of this where I'm just going to kind of share some ideas, but I'm also going to try to look for the comments on this one. So. And if I don't get through all my notes, on this one, it's a no big deal kind of situation. But anyway, excuse me. Just wanted to say again, I hope you're doing well. Life on my side has been pretty intense the last few days, and on a lot of levels. For a lot. Did I just disappear there for you all? It looked to me like I disappeared. Let me see if I can close one or two things here and see if that makes a difference. But I just want to say thank you as well to those of you who have been supporting me. I appreciate it. Anyone who does want to support me, feel free there to look at the video in the description. It should all be there. If you don't see it, reach out. But also just want to say that when I'm busy with the kids and I can't kind of join in with y'all, I really do miss y'all. I appreciate y'all being. It just feels like you're part of my family. And thanks, Daniel. I am closing some things right now. I'm hoping that makes a difference. I think it will. So I'm sorry about that. Hopefully it's enough to keep me from freezing again. But, when I do have to step away for family things, I really do miss y'all. It makes a big difference to be connected with you all. And I try really hard to not go away too long, because y'all make a difference to me, and I hope I make a difference to you. Let me see if there's anything else big that I can close here that I've got going on. Just close one or two more things here. So today's topic, I think, is a good one. It's one that you've probably, if you've been following me for a while, you've probably heard me talk about on one of my interviews here or there. I've probably talked about it 2 or 3 times. Hey, Stephen, great to see you. Hey, Nicole, thank you so much for joining. Hey, Daniel, awesome to see you. Anne-Marie, great to see you. Thank you so much. And Steve, great to see you. Thank you so much. And the topic today is how Christianity is afterlife porn. And I've talked about it a few different ways from a few different angles. I'm going to sort of do it in a bit of a consolidated view, just for the fact of the idea of a monologue. But I feel similar to what some of you may have heard me say before. But again, I want your feedback on this. But I do think that some of these things are worth considering, because it's a fascinating dynamic. Have you ever really stopped to think about how obsessed Christianity is with heaven? And I'm not saying generically, but really, have you sat with the idea for a while? Have you let it just sit there in your head, let it roll around for a while, and ask yourself sort of why heaven was hammered into your head so forcefully, so repetitively? And I think it's wild when you consider the paradox as well as some of the comparisons that we're going to look at today. But we were sort of told, at least I was, from a pretty early age, that it was important to avoid anything that was like fantasy level. And some of us even were told, don't look at Dungeons and Dragons and don't watch this movie and that movie, because, number one, of course, it was deemed inappropriate by the church. But especially when it came to anything that was fantasy that sort of led to something that was sinful, and especially if it was fantasy that had anything to do with pornography. We were warned extensively about these images and how indulging in them was really dangerous on many levels. Number one, it would, of course, displease God. It would give us a false reality. It would warp our minds. It would corrupt our spirits. But at the end of the day, one of the biggest ways that they sold it to us, at least to me, and I think to a lot of guys, was that pornography is a bad idea, in large part because you can't enjoy reality anymore. In other words, if you are, I'm talking from the perspective of a man being told all the things that we were taught as men, like if you're thinking to yourself, I can't wait to get married someday, and you're going to just be so happy to be able to enjoy sexuality and have what you consider at that point a legitimate sexual context to enjoy each other, and it's just such a beautiful part of life. And yet they would say, don't get into porn, because porn is going to actually ruin it. It's going to set you up for a scenario where you're going to think to yourself, oh, my wife is always going to look this way. She's always going to be, she's never going to have any issues with weight, or she's never going to have any issues with wrinkles. She's never going to have any issues with not being up for it. She's just always going to be kind of perfect and always ready to experiment in every way and have so much fun. And it's just going to be a constant, sexual activity, anything you want. And of course, when you get to reality, nobody, neither men nor women, are like this, where everybody's going to be coming to this and saying, sometimes I feel like being intimate, sometimes I don't. If the kids have been all over me all day, maybe I don't feel like being touched. If I don't feel good, if I didn't sleep well, maybe it's not the right time. Maybe it's just time to focus on the relationship and the friendship and the non-sexual touching. But if you go into it with this pornographic mindset, where you're just constantly thinking, you're using pornography to masturbate or whatever for years, and then you get married, they're saying, if you do that, then when you get married, you're not going to enjoy the actual real person in front of you. And like, why would you do that to yourself? Why would you set yourself up for failure by putting this real person, in a sense, in a situation where they're being compared to this fantasy life, where you're like, I hope that you, my real spouse, is going to live up to this Playboy fantasy I've got in my head. And like, why would you do that to the person? That's not reality. It's you're going to ruin your relationship. You need to just love the person for who they are and get to know them in sexual and non-sexual ways. Make this a beautiful relationship. And then when there is sexual activity, it's just part of a whole gamut of ways in which you've loved each other, but you're not comparing yourselves and your sexual activity to something else, either in your past or in your fantasy life. So they would just say over and over, focus on keeping your mind off of fantasy. It will destroy you. It will warp you. It will destroy your ability, first and foremost, to love who you end up with. And the irony is not lost. What did they do next? Like, what was the next thing, as it were, out of their mouth? They then spoon-fed us all kinds of different fantasies. From day one in Sunday school, they paint in your heads this grand otherworldly paradise, a place that's perfect, where there's always pleasure. It's almost like it's drenched in eternal pleasure, and you're supposed to sort of daydream about it constantly. You're supposed to long for it and obsess over it, almost be utterly consumed by the thought of it. Not so much that you can't be, as used to say, of any earthly good, but you should love the thought of heaven, because that's the place where you get to see your Lord and Savior's face. This person who has done everything for you, whom his love has meant the world to you, it's meant eternity to you, and you love him back now for what he's done for you. He's your father. Jesus is your brother. And this is just the best news ever. I can't wait to see his face. And you sort of obsess, as you should. I mean, you shouldn't be oblivious as a Christian. You shouldn't be like, well, heaven's kind of an afterthought. It's all about the here and now. Like, well, the here and now is important, but the here and now is like this little sliver of time, and then eternity and forever in heaven. And so you fantasize about it. You fantasize, even though fantasizing about sexual pleasure was condemned, but fantasizing about eternal pleasure, that's kind of like a holy thing to do. And why was that? What was it? Because heaven was like a good kind of fantasy, the kind of fantasy that was acceptable? Is like a moral kind of escapism? Or was it, in a sense, because the church needed us to be addicted to something big enough to control us, something that they could dangle over our heads, a promise that would keep us locked in mentally and emotionally, enslaved to this ideal that's nowhere to be found here on earth? So I want to unpack this a little bit, but I think that's a great way to frame what I'm talking about. You can't fantasize about this one thing, because you're not going to be able to enjoy the real reality of your real life, your real relationship. But in this other sense, you're supposed to fantasize about what's to come, to the point that you almost shouldn't feel like this is your home. Like this world should not be your home. Heaven's your home. This should just feel like a sort of a temporary pit stop. But at the end of the day, we're going to talk about how this is afterlife porn. They have a holy obsession and addiction with heaven. And I'll admit it, I did have that obsession, and I still do. I still grieve it, and it still hurts. And we'll talk more about that potentially as this goes on, but it is very real for me. I still hurt, and I don't think it's going to go away for the rest of my life. But just being honest and open. But when I was a kid, I remember sitting on those pews in church. Some of the pews in some churches were wooden and very stiff and unforgiving. Eventually, your legs get a little bit numb by the end of the service. But in a sense, even though your body can kind of get numb by the pews or how you're sitting, how hard they are, they make sure that your mind is not numb at all. And unless you're just someone that can't focus and pay attention, and maybe for some reason my mind just could do it extra well, but I could always focus on the preacher. I could always enjoy what they were saying and dive deep with them. Even boring preachers, I was like glued. I wanted desperately to know, what do you know about the Bible? And my eyes were, as it were, glued to the preacher as they painted these vivid cinematic pictures of heaven in our heads. They tell us about streets of gold, about endless joy, the idea that we'll be with God forever. We'll never again feel sorrow. We'll never again know any pain. It was paradise on steroids. It was a utopia where everything broken in life would finally be mended and fixed. And it was utterly beautiful. How could you not want that? I mean, who wouldn't be seduced, as it were, by the promise of eternal happiness? There's no pain there. God even says, at his right hand are pleasures forevermore. At his right hand are pleasures forevermore. I mean, that sounds a little bit sexual, but I don't think they meant it that way. But I think they were talking about like the idea of a king, at the king's right hand is where the person of honor would sit. And they're kind of saying at God's seat of honor, they'll just be pleasures forever. Who wouldn't long for that perfect peace, for an existence beyond death where every single wrong was made right? I know some people have told me they really didn't care too much about it. I did. I wanted it. I craved heaven. I still do. I fixated on it, and a lot of you did. Not all of you, but here's the thing. Heaven was marketed to us exactly like a fantasy. In Christianity, heaven is the ultimate carrot, dangling just out of reach, so close you can almost taste it. And if you're going to live your life in devotion to Jesus, if you pray, you believe, you sacrifice, you will get that perfect reward, the promise of eternal pleasure, of an existence far beyond anything you could dream up on your own. That was the reward for a life of absolute submission. And it wasn't just pleasure. It was indulgence. Excuse me one second. It was like a spiritual ecstasy where we're told that we could desire everything and it would just be so beautiful. It was almost like God was saying for the first time, and our parents and our preachers were saying, this is the one time where you can just kind of let it all out and say, I want so much. I crave it. I lust for it, as it were. And God says, have at it. It'll be such a dopamine rush. It'll be tailor-made for the faithful. And we craved it. We craved it like an addict wants a fix. But again, the irony is what I wanted to focus on tonight. The very Christians who would wag their fingers at us, telling us to avoid those little filthy fantasies of the flesh, they were the same ones who were constantly dreaming about their fantasies of a perfect afterlife. And again, they'll tell you porn's going to corrupt your mind, it'll destroy your spirit. And all the while, they sit in the pews, imagining an eternal paradise where they get all the pleasure, all the rewards, untouched by suffering, perfectly curated for their personal enjoyment and pleasure. It's spiritual pornography. One of the big things, again, is the word idealizing. Heaven, just like pornography, idealizes this kind of perfect place and a perfect pleasure. It's an ideal world. It doesn't exist. It's not real. Just like you would say, that Playboy fantasy you had or whatever, that whatever you put in your head, it's not real. It's going to mess up your real life. So don't focus on it too much, because it's not the way it really works in a real loving relationship. And you're offending your future spouse because you're going to set them up to this standard. And they're also going to know, like, whenever you're thinking, about having intimate relationships with them, they're always going to wonder, are you with me or are you with your fantasy? But that's exactly what we're doing with heaven. We're offering this ideal world, one that doesn't exist, and we're saying you kind of have to enjoy, live here on earth, but you have to stay focused and keep your mind focused on things above. It's an unrealistic, mythologically based fantasy designed to distract you and to pull your attention away from the reality of the here and now. Heaven, just like porn, would seduce believers into prioritizing something that isn't real, prioritizing it over the tangible, authentic experience of right here and now, of human connection, of growth and meaning. And instead of investing fully in this life, you're told, keep your eyes on the afterlife. Trade the messy beauty of now for the empty promises of later. Heaven, in that sense, it's just like porn in the sense that it's encouraging a kind of disassociation and escape from the complexities of life, from like these jagged, cutting edges of reality. It's numbing your mind to the present. It's coaxing you to drift off into a distant fantasy where nothing ever hurts and everything is easy. Every woman's up for it all the time. You need to have sex, bam, there it is. Your fantasy's ready for you. It teaches you to disengage from living because you're so busy waiting for what comes next, and what comes next in your mind is such a dopamine rush. This is mental manipulation. They have you fantasizing about a world that doesn't exist because it keeps you hooked. It keeps you obedient. It keeps you coming back for more. We're addicts. And while they would say, oh, porn is such a horrible addiction, they're saying of all the little slivers of your life, this one addiction is horrible. And then they go out and say, but let's have an addiction and a fantasy about the whole goddamn universe. It's unbelievable. It's fantasy on steroids. Their psychological concepts of addiction and fantasy are off the charts. Psychologists, as we all know, talk a lot about the damaging effects that pornography can have on the brain. They say that it can warp your perception of real relationships, of real connection, of real intimacy. It can create like a false sense of reality that the mind can't really break free from very easily. But that's the same kind of addiction. But instead of thinking of it as in the terms of sexual images, the images are eternal bliss. I mean, think of even the pictures. Some of us saw literal pictures. I know JW has talked about in the Watchtower magazines and the JW publications, they have all kinds of pictures of the afterlife, of what it's going to look like. Most of them filled with, only Caucasian people, ironically, but like they have all these images of what heaven's going to look like. And so you don't just have this word picture, you actually have pictures in your head. Look at this. They may have a lion laying down with a lamb, this actual streets of gold, or the walls of jewels, but at least the word pictures of it's going to be pleasure and no pain forever. And they hand it to you on a silver platter. This is like cognitive conditioning. They're getting you on this hamster wheel, this feedback loop where you're rewarded. The more you think about the afterlife, the more that you think that this is so wonderful, then the more that you can stop thinking about your actual life. They want you. That's what they're doing. They're saying you have a real life. We want you to focus less on that. Focus on the addiction of this reward, this afterlife. This fantasy is so real. The irony again, that they're going to say that fantasy is so real, and yet they're going to tell you, if you're addicted to porn, that this little teeny sliver fantasy is so bad. And they're fantasizing about everything. They tell you, like in Matthew 6, store up your treasures in heaven, as if the joy that you could experience today, right now, doesn't really matter. You're psychologically trained to devalue the present in exchange for the fantasy of the future. Your cognitive dissonance is going to kick in because you're also told in John 17, be in the world, but not of it. So you're here, but you're not really here. You're stuck in this paradox. You're here, but you're not. This is your home, but it's not. This is like the promised land of salvation, but the real promised land is heaven. You're stuck in this paradox where nothing in this life fully matters. And yet it's the only life you actually have. Just like you might say to somebody, why are you so focused on your addiction to your porn image or your fantasy when the reality is you have a loving, wonderful spouse right here with whom you could have a wonderful, mature relationship? And yet you can't do it because you're addicted to the fantasy. And you're putting down your actual real spouse in exchange for something that's not even real. It's like a blow up doll or something. Like, yeah, the blow up doll might always look perfect. It's a blow up doll. It's not real. This isn't real life. But that's what they do. They want you to have this blow up sex doll of heaven in your head. And it always seems perfect in your head. It never talks back to you. It's never real hard work to build that relationship. It's not real. It's not a real relationship. It's disassociation. It's a dopamine rush. It's like, when a porn addict's brain lights up, or any addict's brain probably lights up when they anticipate pleasure. Oh, the pleasure is going to be so wonderful. A believer's brain does the same thing when they think about heaven. The church has programmed us for pleasure-seeking behavior, but only the kind of pleasure that benefits them, the kind that keeps us tethered to their control, their promises, their doctrines. Christianity is the world's most popular fantasy-based religion. I'll say it again. Christianity is the world's most popular fantasy-based religion, or I could even say a fantasy-based worldview. It's a worldview that promises perfect pleasure in the next life while it strips away joy in this one. It really does. And the thing is, they need you to keep buying into that fantasy, don't they? You have to keep coming back for more. Oh, when's the next image? When's the next video come out? When's the next fantasy idea? And if you don't keep coming back for more, the entire system collapses. Who's going to fill up the tithing basket? Without heaven, there's no carrot. Without heaven, there's no reason to follow the rules and to stay hooked on this thing. They have hooked us on afterlife porn. I really hope that hits a nerve. Christianity told us to avoid fantasy. Christianity told us that we have to avoid fantasy, yet it was selling the biggest fantasy of all, the ultimate reward in the ultimate utopia, where all your desires are fulfilled. But like all fantasies, all of them, at their core, they're hollow. They're not real life. And it's time that we see it for what it is. Before I go on, I wanted to read a few quick comments, then we'll go back to what I was going to say. Anne-Marie says, knowing there's no heaven gives me more to live for, since this is our only life. Yeah, I love that way of putting that. It's awesome. Yeah, there's, I remember, was it, I know his name. Not Steve Carell. The Office guy, what's his name? I'm so tired right now. I haven't slept in 3 or 4 days. My kids at night, they crawl into bed. I'm like, okay, you all go to bed. They go to bed. I step and work. And by the time I get to bed, like, Daddy, I had a bad dream. I need to cuddle with you. So I haven't slept in a couple of days. Ricky Gervais, that's something. Ricky Gervais. But he said something similar. He's like, I've got nothing to die for, but I've got everything to live for. Steve says, grieving the loss of afterlife is a huge part of deconversion. Christianity hurt us by making false promises about the afterlife. Yeah, it really did. Hey, Constellation Pegasus, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Great to see you here. The Peace Zone, thank you so much for joining us. Michael Bell, I hear you. Thank you for joining us. Allie, I'm at work, so I'll have to rewatch this one. Most of my coworkers are wearing a cross necklace or cross tattoo, so I can't play this year. Unfortunately, yeah, probably not a good idea. Like Allah's virgin fantasy for Muslims. Yeah, it's a little bit less directly sexual than promising virgins for everybody, but it's certainly a psychological and emotional fantasy. Jalal Hassan, Christianity's insanity and lies. Yeah. We grieve our loved ones who passed away all over again when we deconvert from Christianity and realize heaven is part of mythology. Yeah, that's one of the hardest parts about this. It really is. It really is. That's always annoyed me. Here we are all the way in the world, but yet we're supposed to separate ourselves from it. Makes no sense. Yeah, for sure. Going on back to some of my notes, I was thinking about the theology, as it were, of addiction. Like, why is this fantasy so necessary? Why does Christianity have to have heaven? Why does it push the afterlife fantasy so hard? And I think the answer is going to go back to a word that I used before, but I'm going to use it again. It's simply about control. You think about how a drug dealer keeps customers coming back with promises of a better high. Christianity is offering believers the ultimate fix. The ultimate fix, eternal life in heaven. It's sort of like the psychological equivalent of like spiritual crack. It's going to keep people hooked. It's going to keep them always chasing the next level of euphoria. And the church knows in many ways, I think, what it's doing. I know that not everybody would fall in this category, what I'm saying here, but I think in many ways the church and its leadership, they know what they're doing. They've mastered the art of psychological manipulation. And of all the different ways that they keep you hooked. And we could talk about a lot of other parts of this addiction, but the biggest way that they keep you hooked, in my opinion, is heaven. They need you addicted to something so big, so overwhelming, that you just stop questioning the smaller things. Like, why am I not allowed to live fully in the present? They want you to be so consumed by the promise of this massive thing called eternity later. What's coming next, it's coming later on down the line, but it's going to be big. It's going to be eternal. It's going to be forever. You have to be so fixated on it. And the weight of it, the weight of the timeline, like how big is this? How big is eternity? How big is heaven? How big is the glory? Like, how can I even open my eyes there? It's so bright and beautiful. It gets so overwhelming, and you get so fixated on the idea of this heavenly reward that you become numb to the life you're actually living. I mean, there's sort of like this fear of the loss and the need for escape, because from day one we're taught that this world, our world, is broken. It's a world filled with sin and pain and hopelessness. It's ultimately a wasteland where nothing really matters unless it's connected to God. And the only way out of this mess is Jesus. Heaven becomes the ultimate escape hatch. It's that promised exit from the pain of life. And sort of like an addict that's drowning their sorrows in a substance, like, I'm just so sad. Give me another hit. I need to get through another day. Christians are like mentally escaping, and they're encouraged by the pastors, as it were, they're encouraged to mentally escape through these thoughts of heaven. And it's almost like any time that life discourages you, number one, you focus on the cross of Christ. Look what Christ has done to redeem you from sin. Number two, look what's coming. Look what's coming. What's coming is going to, like, what Christ has done already at the cross and what Christ is about to do when you die or he takes you to heaven is so huge, to the point you can't even imagine it, that it will blow you away, and you will stand back and laugh and say, oh my God, what great things you have done. Oh, wow. I am in awe, in constant, endless awe. This is so beautiful. If only I'd known. I remember that movie, Contact, with Jodie Foster. Do you remember where she was going through the sort of the wormhole thing in that silver ball, and when she finally gets to the point where it takes her up into space, and it takes her like really close, but as a sort of hovering above this other galaxy, entire galaxy, a whole thing, but different from ours. And she's out there in space, and she's like, there's no words. She's like, you all speaking as if we're at NASA. It's like, you should have sent a poet. I've got no words. This is so beautiful. That's what they're offering Christians. It's a very deep form of cognitive dissonance. You're living in one world while longing for the other. This is escapism at a dangerous level. Instead of you dealing with the present, they're offering you a way to mentally check out. And they're creating a dependency, because you need this idea of heaven, because without it, reality feels unbearable. Again, I hope I'm crossing or connecting dots here for you. This is one of the most critical parts of this. They're creating a psychological dependency because you need the idea of heaven. Without heaven, real reality becomes unbearable. It becomes so, oh, I can't believe life is just this. Like, it's just this. It's porn. Like, imagine a man saying to his wife, like, you're the best I get. Like, I don't get the porn girl. You're it. You're all I've got. Yeah, your relationship's going to go down the tubes really fast if you start talking like that. But that's what they do to people. Like, this is it. This is the best life I've got. I don't have something better to look forward to. Reality becomes unbearable in the Christian view of heaven. It becomes the ultimate crutch, a fantasy so alluring that you don't dare to question it. You need it. You need it badly. The church is handing heaven to people as the fix, and they're using it as a way to help you numb the sting of life. And we took it. We took those pills and we said, hand me another. Swallow it down. We needed it. We think too about the need for belonging. I mean, heaven isn't just about pleasure, although it's a big piece of it, but it's also about community, about belonging somewhere. Look, all my Christian brothers and sisters are here. You need to belong somewhere. You You need to belong anywhere, like somewhere where you feel like you belong. They tell you you'll be with your loved ones forever. You'll never be separated from them once you get there. It's this ultimate emotional bait, this imagery of you're reuniting with your dead family members. When you get to the other side of Jordan, make sure everybody's there on the banks of Jordan. You're going to hold them again. You're going to cry tears, but they'll only be tears of joy. This is an emotional shot of dopamine straight to the soul. It's tapping into one of the deepest human needs we have, connection. And the church is playing on your most vulnerable fears, loneliness, isolation, abandonment. And they fill that void in ways that nothing on earth can. Humans seem to be hardwired for connection, and the church knows that, and they exploit it by saying, you belong here with us in church today because you belong in heaven when your life is over. And if you want to get there, you better be here. They're promising you love that never dies, a relationship that never ends, but it's a promise based on a fantasy. They're keeping you tethered to a future that doesn't exist and you'll never get it. And all the while, you miss out on the real relationships happening right here and now around you. And even sometimes it's people focus not just on the relationships, but even on themselves, where they're like, you know what, I kind of need to improve myself, but it doesn't really matter in one sense because the best that I can do, the goddamn best that I can do with my life, I will still be a mess in need of so much more sanctification than is ever going to happen in this life. Therefore, I will do my best to glorify God, but at the end of the day, I can't wait till God actually makes me wonderful. And they even couch in these terms. They say, at the cross, when you are saved, God, at the moment of justification, he is declaring you worthy, judicially declaring you. He's saying, you are not worthy, but like a judge, I will say, I will declare you worthy. But then he says, with sanctification that will result in glorification, I will someday make you worthy. And so you're fantasizing about what a wonderful person I will someday be transformed into. You can't even enjoy your own self. It's not just that you're fantasizing about somebody else, as it were. You're fantasizing about yourself. I mean, it's just endless. The fantasy's endless. And the more you long for heaven, the more you ache for heaven, the less you're able to enjoy this life and invest in it. It's not just manipulation. It's like a robbery. It's a psychological, emotional robbery. They're stealing your present to keep you obsessed with your future that doesn't exist. This isn't some kind of, again, harmless escapism. This is indoctrination. It's psychological control wrapped in a pretty package of eternal bliss. The promise of heaven, yeah, it gives people comfort, but it's a tool. It's a weapon to keep you dependent on the church for meaning, hope, and even your very identity. You're told, don't live for this life. It's corrupt. It's temporary. Nothing here matters in the long run. Just keep your eyes focused on the prize. Again, it's like a heroin addict consumed by their next fix. They're training you to be consumed by the thoughts of heaven, and the church needs you. Because if you stop obsessing, if you stop saying, I need the next life, I need the next shot, I need the afterlife, I need the pleasure that's coming, I need the glory to come. If you start asking too many questions and you don't really need heaven as much, the whole system falls apart eventually. Delayed gratification is a piece of this too. One of the most powerful tactics that Christianity uses is the idea of delayed gratification. Suffering now is okay because the reward that you'll get later is so much greater. It's like a cruel cosmic form of psychological foreplay. They're teasing you with the idea of future pleasure, but only if you endure pain and sacrifice today. You're asked to give up everything, your desires, your sexuality, your ambitions, your very self. It says, put yourself to death. With that, they're saying, we'll give you this promise in exchange that the pleasure you'll receive in heaven will be so much greater than anything you can imagine. It is the ultimate psychological setup. They train you to delay your happiness, to constantly push it off into the future. Like Matthew 6:20 says that the treasures in heaven will be worth it. But what they're really doing is keeping you on the hook. It's like intermittent reinforcement, I think they call it. It's the idea that these inconsistent rewards keep you coming back. You're always hoping for the next hit. Heaven is this inconsistent reward. They dangle it in front of you, and just when you think you've had enough, they tell you, hold on a little longer. Just wait. You can't quit now. The reward's coming. It's coming soon, but it never does. It's an addiction to a fantasy that keeps you locked in the system, craving more, always wanting, always waiting, never receiving. Again, it's afterlife porn. It holds your heart and your mind hostage. You are so busy daydreaming of heaven that you forget to live your life. You're so focused on what comes next that you lose yourself in the process. And the church wins, because as long as you're addicted to heaven, you're going to stay loyal to them. How do we break free? I know these are some intense thoughts, but how do we break free? How do we break free from some of this stuff? I've been where you are. Some of you may still be there. We were clinging to the fantasy. We were terrified of what might happen if we let it go. But breaking free from this addiction, this web of control, is ultimately the most liberating thing you'll ever do. Deconstructing your faith is like breaking free from a drug. And if you've been through that process, you might know more about it than I could. I've not been through that process, although I've had, as I've shared with you, I had a time where I was very much in need of medicines for severe insomnia. And some of them were pretty intense, although the more intense ones, they had such weird side effects. I didn't take them long. It's like, no, I don't want that in my system. I remember one time I took one, and I literally saw pirates around the bed, like real pirates. It's like, no, I don't think so. I'll pass on that one. Thank you very much. But, some of you have been actually like in real drug rehab. And I'm sure that you could tell us more about just the vivid reality of what that's like. And especially if you're in it right now, and I don't want to make light of it. I know that it's a painful process, and I hope you're not alone. I hope you're not alone in your path to get off of drugs. But in terms of the psychological drug of heaven, I have walked that path, and so have countless others. And it's okay to be scared. It's okay to feel lost. But what usually happens, of course, is denial at first. The thought of giving up heaven just feels impossible. It feels too ingrained. It feels too comforting. Like you've built your entire life around this fantasy. And the idea of letting go is like you're stepping into a void. So you deny your doubts, you push them aside, you try to bury them deep, because the alternative can be very terrifying. It's like an addict saying, I can quit whenever I want to, but do I really want to? The fear of loss is overwhelming. Who are you without heaven? What is life? What is this real life without the promise of an afterlife? And denial becomes sort of like that defense mechanism, but it doesn't last forever. You go to anger. Anger, of course, starts to hit. You start to see how deeply you've been manipulated. You begin to realize the church used your fear of death, your fear of suffering, to keep you dependent, and the promise of this wonderful, prize. It's just waiting for you, just sitting there waiting. You won't be able to imagine the great things God has stored up for those who love Him. But that rage simmers and boils. You, bleepity bleep bleepers, you tricked me. That's healthy. It's necessary. You've spent years, maybe decades, chasing a fantasy that was designed to control you. And you've sacrificed your joy, your freedom, your identity for a promise that was never real and was never going to come true. And you were lied to. It's okay to be mad. It's okay to let that anger burn, because in that fire, you start to see the truth. And there's that phase of bargaining they talk about where we try to find this middle ground. We don't want to let go of heaven completely. So we're sort of bargaining. Maybe heaven isn't literal, but spiritual. Maybe it's more of a metaphor than a place. We don't want to lose it all at once. So, and we hold on to little pieces of it. Maybe we think of it as like, it's cosmic force, something, there's energy out there. We're just holding on to some kind of piece. I think it's a natural part of the process. But eventually, I think even the bargaining for a lot of us, it just goes away. And you can't reframe a fantasy that was never meant to be reframed. It was just meant to control you. And trying to fix it only makes the situation worse. And the phase that I'm in, perhaps the next to last, the penultimate one, is depression. You have the grief, the loss of heaven that feels like you lost something real, even though you didn't. You lost something that was fantasy. Like someone wrote you a check for $1 trillion, and then you find out that it's just a bum on a street who found a checkbook, that you never really had $1 trillion. That check was always going to bounce. But while you had it, and you were convincing yourself you had it, it felt pretty damn cool. And now you realize you don't have it, and you're crying about it and depressed and sad because you're grieving it. But in the grief, remind yourself, it feels painful because I thought I had it, but the reality is I never did. I'm losing something that I never had. It was never there. It's like grieving over an imaginary friend, over the death of an imaginary friend. I'm grieving the death of, pretend John, but he was never there. I made him up in my head. It's okay to mourn. It's okay to cry about losing eternal paradise. You feel like you're losing this beautiful gift, this beautiful dream. It's like you're losing a lover. It's like you're waking up from this beautiful dream only to find that the real world is cold and harsh and uninviting. It's like a gut punch. It's okay to feel it really viscerally. It's okay to grieve. Just don't get stuck there. Don't let the sadness weigh you down forever. And I say that as one that needs to hear that message. I'm still sad about it. I'm still stuck in that. The last phase that I hope to get to someday, and hope you're already there, a few steps ahead of me, acceptance. There's just that slow, steady realization that heaven was never real, and that's okay. And once you accept that it was a tool to control you, to manipulate you, you can start living again. You can start focusing on what's real, on the relationships you really have, on yourself, on the moments of joy that you can create here and now, on the beauty of a life lived without the false promises of an eternal reward. You're free to make your life yours, and this is the only one you've got. You're free to find meaning in the here and now and to make a purpose, not a purpose from some ancient book, but a purpose that you decide on. You have the power, and that's the most powerful freedom of all. I mean, breaking free from this addiction is terrifying, but it's also liberating. It's the moment that you reclaim your life. Remember when I deconverted a little over 5 years ago, it was one of the first thoughts to cross my mind. Like, oh my God, none of this is real. There's no heaven. There's no hell. It's just all made up. It's just all made up. It's just all made up. You're reclaiming your life. You're not living in a fantasy that will never come for you, but you're also not chasing a promise that was designed to keep you captive. You're free. You're free to create your own meaning again, free to find pleasure and beauty in the present moment. That's the real reward, and it's all yours. I think about the psychological cost of this. I'm going to read a few comments and wrap up with a thought on the psychological cost. Let's see here. Steve says, if you're 100% sure that you're going to Yahweh's world when you die, what motivation will you have to fix the problems of this world? Yeah, that's a really, really good, that's a really good point. I like that very much. There's so many ways in which thinking about that world does undermine our ability to focus on this one. I think especially the people who, I think that was a really big deal with climate change. A lot of people with climate change are unable to see that this world is important. We have to fight for it. We really do have to fight for it. Bear with me one second. I think I have a troll in the... Bear with me one second. Yeah, my apologies. It's hard when you're looking at your notes. Some trolls get in. But yeah, climate change is a big one. I'm surprised that so many Christians don't seem bothered by it. Like, they're like, what does it matter? What does it matter? At the end of the day, it's all going to burn. God's going to make a new heaven and a new earth. Fire and believers in the house. Great to see you. I'll never understand why so many are afraid of passing away and there being nothing. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about how many Christians are afraid of passing away when they really think that there's something waiting for them on the other side. But yeah, it's also interesting how so many of us who have even deconverted really don't like the idea of this just going back to nothing. It's a real, but that's part of, I think, the addiction is that they bring you to the point of thinking that if that isn't real life and reality and your future, that at that point that there's nothing left. They make real life so awful that it's almost like if you can't have heaven, if that's not real, then what you have left is just utter meaningless. And although I am a nihilist, you can't live there. You cannot live there. And I think I can argue that you can find beauty and make beauty in this life, despite the fact that passing away is still a sad thought to us. Good luck fixing problems on earth. Yeah. I don't feel safe around Christians. Yeah, a lot of us don't. There's so many ways in which they're not trustworthy, and honestly, it seems like they're just telling lies left and right, and they just will not deal with the truth. They really won't. It's very sad. Yeah, extremely extreme Christianity is as scary as Islam. Yeah, I mean, there's stuff that Christians are saying right in these days about putting gay people in prison, putting people that don't bow their knee to Christianity in prison. It's very scary what some of them are coming up with. I really hope that it can be stopped. The social gospel is an anomaly in Christianity because it's just reality escapism. Yeah, I'd argue that too. I'm late, but enjoying the show. Thank you, Tim, everyone. Hey, Derek, great to see you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here. If you're able to worship Yahweh and think of him as your good father in heaven, knowing what he says and does in your Bible, you are not a good person. Yeah, I'd agree with that for sure, Steve. And I've said before the idea that when you think monstrous thoughts long enough, they kind of make you into a monster. And I think that's in many ways what's happened. They've become so numb to what this book has done to them. I feel like the awakening is about letting go of man's dogma. Yeah, absolutely. Very much so. The joy model JC first, others second, yourself lastly. Yeah, exactly. Heaven would destroy your being, your personality, because we're bound and defined by time. Yeah, it is interesting thinking about some of the more it's the bigger, more trippy thoughts of how this would affect you. Is it really you in heaven if you're such a different person because of the reality of not being defined by time, but also the other ways that God's going to glorify you. He's going to take away your sin. He's going to take away in many ways your personality, your temptations. So it's like, is that really you? It's another escapism. Life is way too trippy to try and figure out. Yeah. Religion equals extortionist manipulation. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mbape. If you want to alleviate suffering, you're labeled a utopian. Yeah, very sad how some of them see that. I mean, it's crazy. Even though, Jesus himself talked about helping the poor, and yet Christians in many ways are, at least these days, are very much opposed to that, and for some of the most downtrodden people in our culture. Tim, during deconstruction, when you still thought Yahweh existed, did you start to feel uncomfortable worshiping him? Yeah, that was actually the beginning part of my deconstruction, was that exact question. We were talking about the conquest of Canaan and all the atrocities that were commanded to, kill all the men and women, moms and dads and kids, boys, but, keep the young virgin girls for yourselves. You can take slaves, you can steal their land. Yeah, it was like, I can't defend this guy. This Yahweh character is really nasty. It's exactly where mine started. Suffering is random. How do you change that? I wish we could. I think only technology, but, just, hurricane, whatever, lightning strike, you can hit anywhere. Can't change everything. But yeah, I'd like to think that technology could avoid at least some suffering. I'm honestly excited to think about AI and what it could do for medicine. I think if they could find, a cure for cancer, 1,000 times faster than we've been able to try to cure it so far. I don't know what's going to come in my lifetime, but hopefully by the time that my kids are, at my age, hopefully the AI and the medical advances are pretty intense. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up with a thought about the psychological cost of living in fantasy. Thinking about how addiction to a fantasy, whether it's porn or religion, it really does shackle your mind. It's distorting reality. It's leaving you trapped in this false world. You're disconnected in many ways from the richness of what's real and what's right in front of you. And, when you look at the way that, again, we sometimes see these studies or these presentations about how pornography can warp your brain's wiring and make real relationships just seem dull, unexciting, and even burdensome compared to the fantasy. The problem isn't the images themselves. It's the illusion that they're creating that convinces you that fantasy is better than reality. And in much the same way, Christianity's obsession with heaven is twisting your perception of this life. It's making this life feel insignificant compared to the one to come. And that's where this psychological damage just starts to get so deep inside of us, because when you believe that your current life is just a temporary stepping stone, it's just a quick blink of an eye, it's just a trial to be endured, it's not something to be cherished, you really lose the ability to fully engage with it. I mean, heaven is the ultimate escapism, the ultimate distraction. It's a perfect mechanism for avoidance. It's like a mental getaway from the here and now. It's training you and me to look past our present life and focus on the afterlife. It's an escape avoidance coping mechanism. It's like a defensive mechanism. It's encouraging you to avoid your problems instead of confronting them. It's like detach yourself from the present moment. Mentally live for a time and a place that isn't here and isn't now. And instead of working through the complexities and struggles of this life, you're sort of conditioned to bypass them altogether. Everything that's real, relationships, joys, struggles, heartaches, it gets minimized and shoved aside because it's just temporary. It's just like a temporary stage before the eternal stage. It's forever and ever. The day-to-day beauty of life fades into the background, and it's going to be replaced by this hope of something that seems so wonderful, but it's never going to be there. The here and now is sacrificed for the never and the later that will not come. Sort of like a pornography addiction is sort of teaching someone to mentally detach from reality and to immerse themselves in a fantasy world. Christians are encouraged effectively to disassociate from their current reality. This is a way of thinking where we disconnect from our thoughts and feelings, our sense of identity, and this coping mechanism helps us constantly anticipate our heavenly reward. Oh, is there something that I'm struggling with in this life? Think about heaven. Oh, this doesn't feel right. God will fix it someday. And there's a huge danger in that. It's like an emotional numbness when you're constantly looking ahead and you're always thinking life is up ahead, life is up ahead, life is up ahead. You're constantly longing for heaven. You lose touch with the things that are right here, the things that actually ground you in this life, the people you love, the experiences that shape you. I mean, the moments around us, they can be raw and painful, but they're real. Christianity is like living in a fog that keeps you from truly engaging with your own existence. You're always waiting for something better. You're always on the edge of that emotional high, that state of anticipation that keeps you waiting for the fulfillment from this world to come. And you just know that you cannot be fulfilled in this real world. Nothing here really matters because when you stack it against the eternal, there's no comparison. And that detachment, it doesn't just make it harder, it makes it really hollow. That's why so many of us struggle when we deconvert. It's like, this is it. This is all I get. But in that process, you're also losing yourself. It's stripping you of your autonomy because it's teaching you that your identity is bound up in Christ. You're not living for yourself, but for God's plan. And it's eroding your individuality. You're taught your desires, your dreams, your ambitions, they're all secondary to God's grand design. You are a vessel waiting to be filled up by God. You are a passive participant, as it were, in your own life. And you're not an individual with the power to create your own meaning. You're, that idea of being at a stage of development where you're fulfilling your greatest potential, where you can just blossom in every way as yourself. That becomes impossible when you're constantly told your life is not your own, and even the life that you have isn't really real yet, that the real you is waiting to be presented in heaven. You're waiting for a fulfillment that is never going to come. You're waiting for a meaning that's always out of reach. You're on a hamster wheel. You're never here. You're never fully present. You're constantly yearning for something that's not going to arrive. It's like, if FedEx, sends you a text or something, like the package is coming, it'll be there in an hour. You just stand there at the door, and little do you know that it's been delivered to the next apartment complex over. It's like you can stand there all day. It's the wrong place, and you just stand there and wait and wait and wait and wait and wait. And you lose yourself. This is, to me, psychologically devastating. And the addiction to a fantasy like heaven robs us of our power, of our joy, of our ability to live in the now. It's a very subtle manipulation, and it keeps you small. It keeps you dependent on this system. You're waiting for a life that was never yours to begin with. So, going to wrap this up. Let go of the fantasy because you're going to gain the real thing. And when you break free from that illusion, you start living your life with both feet firmly planted on the ground, and you stop waiting for a reward that will never come. You're going to start creating your moments of paradise, as it were, right here in the life you've been given. I mean, you begin to find beauty in the ordinary things, in the small little moments that for so long you were sort of trained to overlook. I mean, think about even just literal tangible stuff like the smell of rain on the pavement, the sound of laughter echoing through your house, the warmth of a hand held in yours. I mean, those are the real treasures. Those are the ones that you've been missing while you've been chasing after heaven. I mean, it's not easy. We were conditioned to think that heaven was the goal and it was the end all be all. We were spoon-fed this belief that life was just a waiting room. This life is just a waiting room. It's like a holding space for the real life to come. But you get to make your own meaning now. You get to choose your own goal. You're not looking to the sky for validation. You're not hoping for something better on the other side. This is the side. This is the other side. This is both sides. This is the only side. You get to make this life better. You get to find meaning in the moments that you have, with the people that around you that you love, with the passions you pursue. You're creating joy in the real, the tangible, the here and now. And that's as real as the magic gets, but it can be very magical. It can be overwhelmingly delightfully magical. When we stop obsessing over the next life, we finally learn how to live in this one. So my urge to myself and to you, live now. Live for now and live now, not for the afterlife. Just stop waiting. Stop living like life is up ahead. Make this life count. This is the life you have. The world is right here in front of you, in front of me, waiting for us to fully engage with it. Reclaim your power. Reclaim your joy. Reclaim your pleasure, your sense of self. Don't let the church or any system of control, for that matter, have any right to keep you addicted to a fantasy. You're free right now. Free to craft your own happiness. Craft your own future. It's time to let go of this afterlife porn. It's time to stop dreaming about streets of gold and start walking on the earth that you're actually walking on. Life is happening now all around us. The moments of life are happening, and the clock is ticking. Seize the day. Do not waste your time living in the clouds. I've come to realize that that life is so much better without the empty promise of heaven. I still struggle with it, as I gladly confess, but life is better without empty promises. Every single moment matters. Every connection is meaningful. Every breath, every conversation, every tiny joy, it all counts. When we stop living for a future that's not going to come, we can finally start living today in the present. You know, whenever something horrible happens, the phrase that we all use is hold your babies tight, cling to them, hug your babies tonight. Well, you know what? Hug your babies for another reason. This is all we get. You don't get to hug them in heaven. Heaven's not coming. Hug your babies because life is short. That's what this journey is about. It's about breaking free from Christian fantasies and taking back our lives, embracing who we are, finding meaning in the here and now. The fantasy of heaven was just a mirage. This life is real. This life is beautiful. And that may be the most beautiful reality of all, that life can be beautiful if you make it that. I know I'm going to make my life beautiful if I can. I'm going to do my best. Let's see here. Going to read a few final comments and then we'll wrap it up for the night. Thank you all so much for being part of my community. I really appreciate it. Hello all. Hello there says, when you take a scientific perspective on humanity's place in the universe, you realize this life is the most important gift we could ever have been given by nature. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. The fact that we're alive and that we're conscious. I mean, I was just listening to a Neil deGrasse Tyson short earlier today about how so much of life has evolved in a way that doesn't appear to have them really conscious at a level that is anywhere like us. And his point in saying that was not just to say that we're unique, but also to say that like life doesn't need that. Life doesn't need that to thrive. Like life in many ways has been able to thrive without consciousness. We are so unique in this. And the fact that we've evolved to this level and we have our consciousness, it's like our consciousness has become this heaven, as it were, because we can now fantasize and we can come up with such crazy, amazing stories. And yet, what do we do with it? We imagine that most of the universe is going to burn in hell. And only a few of us get to this wonderful place that we think of. It's crazy. Hope forever. Yeah. Too bad there was so much bloodlust. Yep. Forever hoping. Absolutely. The blessing is on those who enjoy life now. Agreed. Wait until you hear about Islam's afterlife narrative. Yeah, I've heard some of it. I'm sure it's pretty nasty. Yes, once he is done with Christianity, Islam is a must. Yeah, I'm never going to focus on Islam anywhere near as much as Christianity because Islam is not my background. I hope that there are a lot of Muslims who, as they escape, are focusing on helping other Muslims escape. Philosopher, but yeah, I definitely want to be. I think we definitely need to be. We need to be philosophers and poets, and I encourage you to do the same. Life's too short to not think deep thoughts, and ideas have consequences, and we can think better thoughts and be so much more beautiful in how we approach this and how we approach our time. What did you replace hope for the afterlife with when you deconverted from Christianity? There's certainly no hope in my heart for an afterlife of any kind or anywhere to go when I die. So that hope was gone. And I know a lot of people didn't care about that hope. They were just like, God, sounds boring. I was not in that category. I wanted to live forever, still do. So that hope is gone. It was just squashed. I wouldn't say I had a hope as much as just a drive and a passion and a purpose to say I want to leave this planet better than I found it, meaning I want to help end mythology as a worldview. And I want to help the next generation have a fighting chance at simply embracing their reality and their identity and not having to spend their lives feeling from religious trauma, and instead just from the earliest days just be able to enjoy their real life, their here and now, enjoy their humanity. So true about This Is All We Have, Tim. This has been a huge topic for me after deconverting. Thank you, Olival, for sharing that. Yeah, it is all we have. I know for a lot of us, that can be a discouraging thought, at least at first. But I definitely think that over time, when we realize, like, even though it hurts in one sense, I would rather live my life for real, for the truth. It's like that phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living. I'd rather live in reality, even though it doesn't live up to my, afterlife porn fantasy. I'd rather live in reality and that be my real life, as opposed to just always thinking that all these things, the gospel and the cross and heaven, are all real. Some of our loved ones are going to go to their deathbed, and they're never going to have really lived a day of their lives. You realize that, right? They're going to go to their deathbed, and they will have never lived a day of their lives. It's sort of like the Matrix analogy. They will have never opened their eyes and used them once, not for 1 second of their lives. Not even perhaps theoretically. It's crazy to think about. Everything is heaven, good, bad, time, space, everything, no going or coming. It's just happening. Yeah, it's heaven, it's hell. It's just reality. Yeah. Can only just pop in for a moment, but I have to say, great channel. Thank you so much, man. Appreciate it. Everyone, please go like and subscribe to the Rabid Atheist. Doing awesome work on his channel. Awesome stuff. And Steve, thank you so much for your encouragement. And Steve, I'll let you wrap this up. I feel sad when I drive by churches and see people walking inside. Yeah. It's like they're all going for their hit. They're paying for it. They're all going for their hit. And it's very, very sad to think, especially when you're thinking too about the fact that they're not just adults. They're taking children inside, and they're psychologically manipulating and abusing children and thinking this is all real. Blood magic's real. The cross is real. You're all sinners who need a savior. God sees in your head and he's judging you, and heaven's the prize. Hell is the risk. It's like, oh my gosh, please stop. You're hurting children so badly. Please stop. Well, that's what I had for tonight. I can't stay on for too much longer. I would love to just chat more, but that's the end of the comments anyway. But I could probably drag it out. But I need to help my little boy get to bed and get ready for school tomorrow. But I just want to say thank you all so much again for being part of my community. Love you all so much. You mean the world to me. And I hope you all are doing well. I will be probably live streaming at least once, if not twice, tomorrow. So keep an eye out and look forward to the next conversation. Thanks so much. Have a great night.